Hello everyone, question and answer video today. I will simply read this message that was sent to Schwerpunkt's private email. Schwerpunkt, many historians, such as yourself, often emphasize the Romano-Germanic syncretism that gave rise to medieval Western Europe. With this in mind, I'm often surprised to see that there is no overt acknowledgement on the existence of a Greco-Slavic civilization. In a broad sense, there seems to be a similar parallel of the Slavs and Germans adopting Roman civilization, but the latter often receives more attention. Though I fully acknowledge that your YouTube channel has provided innumerous examples of the Greek and Slavic cultural union, you still have not recognized their civilization as something that is as palpable as Latin Germanic Europe. I was wondering why this was the case, or perhaps I just need to spend more time digging through your videos. I'd also like to clarify that I'm not a nationalist from Eastern Europe. I'm an American with heritage from East Asia. My question stems from genuine curiosity and not from nationalist vitriol. Regards, a fan. Alright, I like this kind of questions because they're straight to the point and they frame the matter pretty clearly. This is a very interesting topic that frankly makes me realize, frankly is the adverb here because of course of Latin Germanic civilization, makes me realize that of course I should talk more about this topic. And today I will not just answer the question, but I will provide that additional explanation of why it may seem, for example, that my channel is sort of unbalanced, if anything, and or the reasons that stand behind the actual emphasis on Romano-Germanic civilization, which I think at this point in history are really crucial to recover in ways that at different and actually the majority of levels in a civilizational sense seem more relevant, priority to some degree. So I will just address the message once again. So many historians, such as yourself, often emphasize the Romano-Germanic syncretism that gave rise to medieval Western Europe. Overall, this is correct, but as we will understand from this video, of course, there is a broader scope than just Western Europe, because Western Europe may sound too narrow. I propose, prepotently, by the way, on my channel, the existence of a Central European, a Middle European culture, right? Just as, for example, other things I don't consider really real, the existence of a modern era, right, between the medieval and the contemporary one, that are also very specific. I know that in the Anglosphere, normally the modern era encompasses also essentially today. Like when I say contemporary, I actually mean it more in a continental European sense, like from essentially the French Revolution onwards. Thus, I would not narrow the importance of Romano-Germanic civilization merely to Western Europe narrowly meant. I understand that in this message, Western Europe may be understood in some broader generic sense, but we also must understand which one is this, because it's just a detail, right? A shadow, a bit of the whole point. But say, what is Western Europe? Especially, what is the counterpart to Western Europe? Is there the existence? Say, it's like Europe cut in half, right? So you would include, for example, Germany, that I consider to be a Central European country, to that. I think, in general, that such subdivision is conventionally modern in nature. I use it itself exactly because I know that there are people out there that are going to search for things like, for example, Western, Central. I have lots of views, for example, for my Medieval Central Europe playlist. You watch it a lot, and that means that it resonates in ways that are relevant, right, in a historical sense and more. Sometimes I got angry people, including from, I will not say which part of Central Europe, said, no, we are actually Western. It's the concept, that, say, the centrality of Romano-Germanic culture, civilization, and empire in Europe is something we will understand again better today, but for this very reason, it cannot stop to a specific area of Europe, or at least, even though, of course, the Western or the Central one may be pretty big. You can divide between northern, southern as well. And today I'm not going to define this more than much, but it's exactly the point of it all, right? If we talk about a Romano-Germanic culture, we're talking about Rome, we're talking about England, I make lots of videos about, say, the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons, about the Merovingian Empire, about the broader Roman legacy. What was this, right? Where we're talking something ethnic in nature, because most people do not take into account the imperial Catholic tradition, and so these terms always get down to some kind of, again, conventionally modern reference that is mostly either ethno-linguistic or whatever. In fact, the especially like in the 90s, that was the peak of this kind of modernistic classifications. There were attempts to, as you know, divide the world into different sort of macro cultural areas. And indeed, there is the sense that rather than the Greco-Slavic civilization, the Greek Orthodox civilization was allegedly something. It's a very problematic concept for reasons that we will explain today. So I will not throw in other sort of scholarly views on this, because at large they've been surpassed. They've been, in any case, they haven't resonated, right? Somebody important, maintaining a preeminent academic position at some point came up with this great, definition, the wisdom, the categorization. These things did not survive even for 10 years. You can argue somebody like in the most recent historiography may refer to them. Still, like also in the age of digitalization, you can find texts coming from the last decades, maybe making reference to that. Mostly they are contemporary history studies. As far as even modernists, medievalists like me, etc., like we do not really talk about this more than much, because we have a bit more of a nuanced and sort of shaded, but still more concrete, I would say, an objective idea of how careful you should be about this kind of categorizations. So just to set the tracks also for this video, it's within these boundaries that we are discussing. Of course, I'm not claiming that whoever wrote this question was reasoning that way. On the contrary, I think that they understood the general point. They know my work, at least I presume. I don't know who this person is. I will assume it's a guy, because most of my viewers are. In any case, so they gave rise to medieval Western Europe, and yeah, we could fundamentally approximate this sense of Westernness that indeed is also the Occado, like there is all an idea of the migration of the boreal stock from west to east rather than the other way around, but way before, for example, the same Indo-European migration, the whole Atlantid sort of thing. But we will not talk about that, because definitely in tradition, even for medieval times, these cardinal points are not that random at all, and not just in Europe, by the way. In any case, more or less you can approximate in this way. I did make videos in which I was saying the rise of Western Europe, and the reason why I choose the title, I choose to add specifically Western, is that indeed, conventionally and categorically, many people are okay with the relative ambiguity existing within this, right? If you talk about, again, medieval Western civilization, I'm including, for example, parts of Germany at large, or if not entirely. I'm considering even parts of Scandinavia, etc. So it's more like the broader Frankish Latin legacy, again, Romano-Germanic one, that you can consider as a whole, which also, and this is the crucial point of the video as well, includes Slavs, as it includes Celts, for example. And so it's not merely Romano-Germanic, but it's contained within the Romano-Germanic system for reasons that I'll try to explain part now, but that you're probably more familiar with from my videos about the imperial Catholic tradition, the role of the Germans in the Renovatio Imperii, the centrality of the Holy City of Rome, way more importantly for the Westerners than even the same Jerusalem, within a Christian world. And so much that we have to entangle also from previous history. the big elephant in the room is really this one, right? It's the fact, it might be this little spoiler, that when we talk about Slavs were part of, you talk about the Poles, the Czechs, the Croats. We're looking at peoples living within the West, the Slovaks, right? This will trigger people because every time you talk about more contemporary national subdivisions, well, that people did not exist at Similia, and that's also a great part of the reason why my videos about Slavic history get so much views and juicy drama, but also, I must say, a fair amount of appreciation, by which I'm really impressed, because normally every time I see somebody discussing this on the internet, that they are tearing each other apart, and it seems that at the end of the day, even though I'm not an insider in those cultures, I managed to assess them in a historically satisfactory way, at least for those that I suspect also mostly coming from that background are interested in. And in fact, I would like to point this out, that this care of mine towards the Romano-Germanic civilization has, in fact, nothing to do with any kind of antagonism towards other ethnicities. Not just, again, because we will explain now what's the deal. There's nothing wrong in saying, that there is an objective difference between the development of a people or another. There are surely political hijackings that occur all the time, especially in the last years for obvious reasons, unfortunately. But I have overall a very, again, comprehensively Catholic understanding of the unity of Europe and of the empire in general, so that to me, if you talk about the Greeks, if you talk about the Slavs, there's nothing really intrinsically wrong about them. It's rather about observing politically how things unfolded, making an historical assessment, and trying to understand why certain systems lag behind, and why, in fact, a big spoiler of the video, also for what I just said about, for example, the presence of the Slavs within the Romano-Germanic system, and so the obvious appreciation I must have for that as an achievement of the same peoples, right, is the fact that, in my opinion, there is no such thing like a Greco-Slavic civilization. Indeed, if this were to be just the entire video, do I believe in the existence of a Greco-Slavic civilization? No, right? Because historically, as we understand now, there isn't much of it to begin with, and surely, and especially not in the way we can talk about Latin Germanic Europe in a broader civilizational sense. And I did discuss this stuff already, so it's obvious that given the amount of videos I uploaded, nobody can watch them all. I have, however, a Slavic history playlist, so if you browse that, I'm sure you will come across this kind of thoughts. But this is a good question for a channel like mine, because it could be the launching pad for further videos on the topic. And so in order to objectivize further the issue, there is a video I made last summer or autumn that is titled Romanized Germans and Barbarized Byzantines, the hard-to-die myth of Latin Germanic backwardness, which deals a lot with this topic, especially for early medieval history, which is indeed foundational in an ethnic sense, especially for the Slavs, as a matter of fact, that are in part discussed, but my focus is rather on Byzantine civilization. That, in fact, is the most counter-positive model by scale to Latin Germanic Europe. This is how I see it in my head, right? Rather than seeing Constantinople with Slavs attached, which is definitely not my historical view of the whole, I rather see definitely Byzantine civilization as a competitor to the Latin Germanic one, also with very positive traits in it, but definitely in a way that was overrated for some reason that I will try to re-explain today, even though the whole thing does not focus on the Byzantines only, nor on the vexata question, the Romanity of the Byzantines, etc. And again, we have just so much time. But in a way that I think during medieval history, also if I were to answer in a slightly more complex way, I think does not leave any doubt about who was the winner. Like, if we understand this as a competition that, again, did exist to some degree, right? Just by and I realized that this notion is not present much in pop culture. Like, if you actually study medievalistics, if you are into the broader scholarly or historiographical debate in general, first of all, there is not much of a debate about the existence of a Greco-Slavic civilization. To make the long story short, you can't talk about the Greek Orthodox world, and that obviously includes Byzantines and Slavs, but it's not such a cohesive system like the Latin Germanic one, nor especially, and this is the thing that I'm really surprised by not seeing on the internet more and much, that instead tends to overemphasize the exotic coolness of sort of the Byzantine world and its sort of offsprings, at least in an Orthodox sense, which is already a contentious idea in that way, but is the macroscopic political, military, and social superiority of the Latin Germanic system. There's no doubt from a demographic, economic, technological point of view. Yeah, I know there are people out there who still believe things like, I don't know, the Renaissance happened because Byzantine refugees fled to the West after the Ottoman conquest. That's not how the Renaissance happened, first of all. To make comparisons, the Latin Germanic world surpassed the Byzantine one already by the 12th century. And even before, there can be a huge debate regarding what actually constitutes some kind of backwardness. There's a lot that the West has done in sort of depicting, especially stressing mostly like a northern perspective, because especially also British and in this sense Anglo-American historiography focused naturally more on that region of Europe, like the idea of the Dark Age, of this general sense of backwardness of Middle Ages equates to smoky mud huts and this kind of thing. And basically, also for reasons that are really difficult to accept still in the West, like the enormous, basically the complete removal at some levels of the acknowledgement of a continuity of Romanity and Roman civilization and development in southwestern Europe, right? There is a disproportionate civilizational concentration in Europe that remains throughout the entire medieval millennium in essentially what is fully the Romano-Germanic West. We're talking Gaul, Italy, Spain to a degree, and that also encompasses, in fact, even countries like England. In fact, I tend to give the Anglo-Saxons probably more than the same British historiography wanted to acknowledge to a degree. There are problems there. The Protestant Reformation, the anti-papistic ideology. So there is a problem in the way we conceive the Middle Ages to begin with that does not help anyone in having an objective assessment of this all. I have a very peculiar perspective that I realize, having developed through Schwerpunkt, that, as you know, I carried out during my general historian career that was quite intense. And so I realized just by talking with people that I consider sometimes much more sort of, strictly speaking, cultured and educated than me, normally absent from any curriculum, right? If I hadn't decided at some point to make videos about every single region, medieval Europe, talking about every single military at the time, in depth, etc., I would have not had this comparative capacity with the obvious objectivity that comes from that, looking at these powers throughout the centuries, gathering information, looking at sort of macroscopic data that sometimes actually go missed along the way. You may barely learn at the beginning of your own career, and then getting lost into hyper in-depth niche topics that are, I mean, Schwerpunkt ones are hyper generalistic in comparison. Of course, we're talking mostly in academia, that have completely severed historians and basically any other scientist at this point from a more comprehensive understanding of the world, or at least an attempt at doing that, which is also, by the way, something that the medievals from their side were incredibly capable of, because they did stem really from a very sound awareness of the Catholicity of the system, including the Byzantines. By the way, I encounter still people that friendly antagonize with me by saying, but the Catholics did not exist. The name of the church is Catholic. Like the Orthodox Church is called Catholic as well. If you're not aware of this thing, it may be very, very difficult at this point to understand anything else, especially when, again, and unfortunately, these topics get weaponized, instrumentalized today, exactly exploiting people's ignorance in elementary historical education, for that matter. And unfortunately, a great part of this, but what about the Byzantines or the Islamic world? What is at least sparking interest today towards this areas becoming oppositive to the West, right? Because the notion is that the West is corrupt, is decadent, is done for, and these places instead are, so pure and brave and cultured and traditional. This is actually not true. Let's leave aside the fact that Greece today fits the Western world. Other things happen in the meanwhile. People, of course, have also a sort of short-ranged idea of understanding West and East mostly on the basis of the NATO and sort of post-socialist world. But the sense is that this memory today is so short that people mistake radically underdeveloped countries for places where people live normally just because, I don't know, they've been effectively civilized by the West and have a minimal technology that doesn't make them look like they still lived in the Middle Ages, as, forgetting all the macroscopical political, social, economical indicators, and even just the basic cultural one, right, including the disproportionately anti-traditional, atheistic, divorce, like all what you can imagine in terms of sexual violence, poverty, immigration of of Islamic immigrants, for example, in places like Russia, as if didn't exist. Like it's all normal, everybody's happy there, or it's a model that is triumphing. No, right? They're actually struggling way worse than us, and in ways that in fact are under everybody's eyes in terms of shortcoming to begin with. It is not to say that there isn't a generalized crisis, and of course this encompasses us all, and pretty serious things are happening overall, but we must also be objective in comparing things, because otherwise you can't react in a proportionate way, even just to fix the problems, which of course is beyond today's video's focus. So, continuing the message, with this in mind, I'm often surprised to see, so the fact that we do acknowledge a Romano-Germanic syncretism, this is an interesting perspective as well. We'll discuss better later in comparison, in fact, to the Greco-Slavic one, because how much did the Greeks and the Slavs syncretized? Not much, right? At least compared to the Romano-Germanic world at large. And I wouldn't use properly the term syncretism were I to describe this much, because that did exist, even from an ethnic point of view, and this is true also for the Slavs, say in Greece, to be sort of locally specific. But there would be other places where this happened, including, I don't know, in Anatolia, etc. But there is something sort of more hierarchical in here, including the fact that, I don't know, the official language of the Romano-Germanic system was Latin, right, even in Germanic countries. That, as I also discussed in other videos, the Romans, at some point during the migration era, become Germans from a juridical point of view, so that literally the Italians believed to be Longobards in that Germanic sense, not in the sense that they did not know that, of course, there were Romans that were largely Celto-Italic, again, that's what they were, but they adopted that identity, which may seem confusing at some point. In fact, many people struggle with this. I still have people asking, but, why, if the Franks invaded Gaul, don't the French speak German? I mean, we are at these levels, like complete lack of any idea of demographic distribution and power dynamics. Because also in that there is a sort of ethnocentrism that I must say is unfortunately more shifted from the Germanic side of the aisle, which is also actually not much a nationalistic thing, but also there are a bit of an Anglo-American bias towards that part of Europe in general, and sort of the rest does not quite matter. And even skipping some of the most interesting Germanic parts of the world, for example, southern Germany, and her cultural, civilizational accomplishment, etc. In any case, with this in mind, I'm often surprised to see that there is no overt acknowledgement on the existence of a Greco-Slavic civilization, right? And I presume here that this statement encompasses not just, as the message explains later, for a lack in my content, but in general also in historiography, which is valid, and we will explain why. And as I said before, there is no such thing like a Greco-Slavic civilization. Given that words are just words and we use them conventionally to understand one another, we, if anything, speak of a Greek Orthodox world. And the reason is, like, first of all, there is a Roman world, right? It's to say the Latin West, right? It's not like the Germans were Latin, were Italic, right? Because they belong to Latin Christendom. It is because, of course, Rome dominated. So, in this sense, since we associated Greek-speaking Constantinople as the recipient of mostly Hellenic, the inheritance of the Hellenic civilization, and the center from which what we conventionally call the Orthodox Church spread. Again, the official name of the Orthodox Church is Catholic, because the only true name of the Church is Catholic since the beginning. This is not contentious. This is literally in the official name of the Orthodox Church. We tend to look at the spaces that the Byzantine Church, I usually use this term, the Byzantine Church spread to say, well, roughly we're looking at the Balkans, we're looking at Eastern Europe. Actually, Byzantine Christianity, so to say, that had a tendentially, again, hierarchical and say at least monarchic direction in different ways from which the papacy would become, because in the Byzantine Empire, the emperor de facto controlled the church, even though the latter was autonomous in many ways, but it's not like, again, in the West, where you have a diet, emperor, papacy, and the papacy really shapes itself as a monarchy on its own. You have, from one side, what people see as relics, of course, of Hellenic culture, like in southern Italy. That is also a bit of an overrated concept. Like, there is this idea that basically southern Italy was a sort of a Greek Italic mix of some sort. People even remember that what the Italics are. This is not true, right? Ever since antiquity, there's no doubt that Hellenic civilization flourished in Magna Graecia, and that the coastlines were very much, in control of the Greeks, etc. But throughout this whole period and throughout the Middle Ages, the overwhelming majority of the population, by far, we're talking millions versus a few hundreds of thousands at most across the entire region, were Italic, right? And they spoke their own language, and they did not speak Greek, right? And it's like, I don't know, in Gaul, right? The influences of Massalia went typically, like, I don't know, in Scythia, etc., like just a few tens of kilometers inland, nothing more, nothing less. In medieval times, you do find this Greek Orthodox presence in southern Italy. You find it up to Central Europe, such as in Moravia, for a while. In fact, in these last places, it eventually gives way to Roman Christianity. The reason I explained in that video about the Byzantine conversion of Khazaria, of Bulgaria, and the Rus, I don't remember the title exactly, made multiple videos on that, but there was one including Khazaria in the title, that I think explains pretty well how, compared to the Latin Church, the Byzantines went on to Christianize and therefore impart control through, and very differently from how the Pope would successfully achieve in the 11th century, that in fact the Byzantines did not achieve, just the fringe of Europe. I mean, objectively, what do the Byzantines get? The Balkans and Eastern Europe, even parts of the steppes. So all the rest of the continent, aside from the Islamic Spanish for a while, it's a very contained place, are Roman Christians. They are under the papacy. That also develops an enormously more cohesive institutional administration and common identity. People like to stress very much sometimes the difficulties in Christianization, etc. This was actually a talk point of liberal historiography in the last decades. Not much strictly the last one, but yeah, roughly from the last one before, from a long time, because they had to show that the church was bad and whatever. But the more you study papal history, the more you study the Latin Christendom, the more you realize how disproportionately more interconnected this entire system was, how effectively from Rome there were bishops all over Europe that were connected with the center and that responded to a veritably unitary church, which is something very different from what was happening in the Greek Orthodox world, where at large, like these were separated countries and more or less recognized, of course, some important ties with Constantinople, but just in terms of metropolitic hierarchy and not much, because especially from the 11th century had ever been a great deal of direct involvement into local ecclesiastical policy from the center. This is actually true since the beginning. I made recently a video about the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons that shows you not just one of the most successful pages in Romano-Germanic history, which I very much emphasize in that video, by the way, but literally the familiarity, by the way, with the system. Like the Greeks, this is also the background story. The Greeks didn't really mingle with anyone, right? They colonized just coastal areas and they remained enclosed more or less in their xenophobic view. The Romans really went on ethno-linguistically Romanizing Western Europe and its bigger countries, namely, the same Italy, of course, but Spain, Gaul, leaving remarkable traces, so to say, in Britain, in Germany, along the Danube, and never forget this, the Balkans, the Danube, right? Remember that in late antiquity, the Danube did not speak Greek. They spoke Latin, even though they, of course, like if we're talking about the administration of the empire, but also what generally was filtered to the locals, so much so that still, in fact, the Slavs that come later at large, that's also a relatively contentious, or shouldn't be a relatively contentious thing. In any case, if you look at Serbo-Croatian, etc., like it has, aside from the Romans, Romanians, you find an overwhelming Latin legacy in vocabulary and more. This is because the Romans handled things differently from the Greeks. They, of course, already in antiquity overly succeeded compared to the Greeks, because Alexander was the model for everyone, but he did something very different with Hellenism, and the strictly Hellenic world did not actually expand beyond a specific geographical dimension, or at least around the Aegean, with some sort of colonies everywhere that, however, remained fundamentally enclosed within themselves, regardless, again, of the culture that they managed to emanate, but not the sort of ethno-genetical capacity to mold this world in their own image, right? Alexander tried it in a much bigger sense, and that's why Hellenic and Hellenistic, Alexandrian are different things, founding various Alexandrias out there, but still in a different thing, because all there the background was still Hellenic, right? So you cannot say that, for example, I don't know, the connection, just to compare apples to oranges between Rome and England was the same between Constantinople and Kiev. All right. There were a different story. Admittedly, here we're even looking at the very opposite. I mean, England was sort of the furthermost from Rome, and yet it was an enormous success, and the Roman Church did control the English one as well. Between Constantinople and Kiev, you have the strongest partnership, and yet the contact within the Greek Orthodox world, and yet the actual connection, the actual Byzantine interference in routine affairs is much scarcer. So this gives you all a dimension to ponder upon regarding the actual existence of this koine, the supposed Greco-Slavic civilization, that for this and many other reasons did not quite exist, right? Yes, there are the Bulgarians, right, that are also knocked out de facto as an actual polity by the same Byzantines, right, and that are fundamentally incorporated, yes, in that word, but that were sort of regionally limited in their center of power that more or less had gravitated around Constantinople based on this sort of the Danubian frontier, the Balkan frontier. And that is, again, pretty contained. As I was saying before, Latin was the official language of the entire West. Greek wasn't, right? The Slavs had their own alphabet, surely mutated from Greek, but actually adapted to what the Slavs were already using as runes, etc. And the same official language is Slavonic. This is not even to say that this Slavonic did not have a big influence or that it wasn't in many ways culturally informed by Constantinople, but it was essentially separated. It's not like Latin becoming the language of medieval Europe as, I don't know, Italian became the language of modern Europe during the Renaissance. This is a completely different picture where actually also the cultural and the literate means to spread civilization were much more limited than the West. I mean, the West was really cohesively expanding from the Romano-Frankish model to the point of making the same Western Slavs part of the system, the same Celts. There's also, in fact, a pre-migration era background there that is important to stress. All these countries were different. All the Slavic countries are different, or the Latin countries are different. Actually, much more different than they tend to be. Probably the more cohesive are the Germanic ones, if you're talking about strictly ethnic cohesion. But I was thinking to make a video about this, considering how far and wide, for example, Latin and in part also the Italic colonization went compared to the Germanic one. We think about this migration here as probably as a tidal reversal of ethnic upper hands, etc. But if you actually look throughout all the sort of the Germanic migrations throughout ancient and medieval history, you realize that fundamentally, with the exception of Britain, that also is a heavily sort of Romance-influenced world, especially, of course, after the Norman conquest, the Germanic world stops at the Latin one. It doesn't matter, of course, how influent this had been in the Latin West, there is a heavy Germanic influence in all the French and Italian, etc. But how fundamentally they preferred to expand as they had done in antiquity, mostly the East, right? There isn't a literal depopulation or simple displacement of the entire Germanic. In part during the migration era, yes, there are parts of Central Europe that get Slavicized exactly because the Germans have in part left. But compare, for example, to the demic concentration in Western Europe, like the Germans are at most a few hundreds of thousands at a time, migrating in pools of millions of people. So that's also not bringing, in fact, to the Germanization, if not of, as we said before, Britain and a few, of course, frontier areas that are very important, get Germanized over time, but that also got themselves a lot of Latin influence across time. That's why, to me, there's no such thing like a Greco-Slavic civilization. The Byzantines never went on saying, okay, the Slavic world is ours. Or we have such a strong, intense partnership with the Slavs that we have to consider them as part of our system. It's not like Rome ever said, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, that we should just bond with the Germans at some point. But it's the Germans that were attracted to the Roman world to the point of eventually becoming part of it, and its civilization managing to encompass them all, because they all become Latin at a point, religiously wise. With the Slavs, it's actually not like that. Many Slavs, like the Poles, again the Czechs, the Croats, fall into the Roman orbit. The Bulgarians, for example, flirt with Rome for a long time, exactly to escape Constantinople. There was never such a thing. It's not like the Longobards ever flirted with Constantinople in order to, or even just later when even the papacy was trying to dislodge, for example, the Siculo-Normans by a Byzantine invasion. Everybody thought, okay, well, so we should expand successfully Orthodox Christianity to, I don't know, southern Italy at large. It would have remained fundamentally unchanged because it would have been just a decentralized area. And this speaks of ratios of strength, right? You can't unsee there, of course, how the West not just overwhelmed the Byzantine world, but also the Arab one, for example, in the Mediterranean. I made multiple videos explaining how the Westerners dominated basically the entire European Mediterranean system just by, for example, mean of Italian trade and banking from the high to late Middle Ages and far beyond, meaning that also great parts of North Africa, of the Middle East, were actually and very deeply connected with the West. The same is actually true for the same Greco-Slavic world. I mean, the Byzantines get taken over, get colonized by the Franks, by the Italians. You have Eastern Europe as well, as I documented, and this is very fascinating to me, especially as a military historian, an enormous Western influence, especially before the Mongol invasions that truly come at a time in history after which, while also the system would have sort of shrank because of the great late medieval crisis to more regional realities that departed from this broader Catholic universal understanding of power exercising, that imported heavily much more arms and armor from the Western world than from the Byzantine one. Actually, in between, in order of importance, it's the West, the Turks of the steppes, and the Byzantines. And great part of the notion that, I don't know, a Ruthenian hero looked like a late Roman martyr, military martyr, let's say, is due to the specifically Byzantine iconic artistic style that was that repetitively unchanged and fundamentally based on that notion. But when you study not just part also the same Ruthenian iconography, but especially archaeology, you realize that it was an extremely different world. Also, the Mongols arrived, and in general, like the Slavs and at least the Eastern Slavs and the Greeks have relatively few to do with one another, without mentioning that also within the Byzantine Empire, even though some Slavs, as you know, settled up to the Peloponnese, some took boats arriving even to North Africa, like would be actually absorbed by the Byzantine culture, the Romaioi, the interland, right, we talk about even the same Peloponnese, but mainly the Balkans, would largely remain Slavic, and or at least was not really a place where the Byzantines were particularly interested in interacting, because since antiquity the Greeks were about cities, coastland, and that maritime interconnection with one another, their own specific Hellenic culture that was deemed to be the only thing that existed in the world, the perfect one, everything else being trash outside of it, and the world being essentially Greek and nothing else existing outside of it. Not even when the Romans were actually dominating them, except of course they became Romans in by name, even though they of course kept speaking Greek there, right? So this is incredibly important because beyond this world, you do not really see much interconnection between the Greeks and the Slavs. You have this phase where, again, Rome and Constantinople are in theory cooperating, but actually competing for the evangelization of Europe, and Rome overwhelmingly wins actually the most important of the Slavs, right? The Central European Poles, Bohemians are at large, as a region more developed than Eastern Europe, meant as properly today's Ukraine, Russia, Belarus. Even the Baltics eventually are Roman, Scandinavia as well. So there is an overwhelming Western interconnection that reduces this disconnected Orthodox world in the fringe to some, of course, subdeveloped place that cannot compare exactly in those terms, but especially just out of, okay, the Byzantine Empire collapses, right? And we have explained countless times how this happened. The system was very sclerotic within itself. There were very few oligarchic families that ruled everything. There are no such thing like autonomies in the Byzantine world, right? The Western feudal system is paradoxically much more open to the development of communal autonomies, right? That's, again, how the Italian maritime republics took over the Mediterranean and also the Western European markets at large, including the Byzantine Empire. As you know, there is no comparison between the competitivity of the West at sea, in banking, etc., with East, that is growing actually depending on the West. You know, the toxic relation between Constantinople, Venice, the peasants, the Genoese, etc. When you talk about Eastern Europe, these are literally the least densely populated, the least developed, and the least interconnected lands in the entire continent, right? Just the far northeast that in part is occupied by the Rus as well is worse. But at large, before especially the Mongol invasions, that system was paradoxically much more gravitating around the West. This is also in terms of the conversion. If you study the history of Olya of Kiev, you realize that she was hesitant, right? She had connections with the West. There was all an infight locally to side with both sides. So this is not like, I don't know, the Romano-Germanic world where Rome was always Rome. There could be Arians, but they had nothing to do with Constantinople. And at large, they all converted to full-fledged Catholicism and always maintained preferential and unique relations with Rome. It's not like there was somebody in Gaul who said, okay, now we will recognize Constantinople. Aside maybe some still Greek-speaking elite of some southern Gallic Mediterranean city that didn't care very much at all even about that. In that age, there wasn't even a split, as you know, between Rome and Constantinople as churches. So that doesn't even count, frankly. I would actually show you, not an exception, but something that tendentially shows what happens to those who try to imitate Constantinople. The Visigoths, they are the only ones that basically are crushed in the West by the Arabs. The others are the Byzantines in Sicily, for example. But the peculiarity of the Visigothic monarchy, as you know, is the fact that it's very... it actually fails at some point. This happens for local, actually Romano-Germanic reasons. But the Hispano-Visigothic elite that is also represented by the local episcopate manages to, in fact, suffocate Toledo, that is the capital of the Visigothic kingdom. The kings gradually lose power in favor of this private oligarchy. In the Visigothic kingdom, it's not like they are powerless at large, but the episcopate establishes the councils of Toledo that are deliberately imitating the great ecumenic ones of Constantinople, right? Toledo is much more straightly inspired from Constantinople and the Byzantines that are, by the way, within Spain at that time in the south. They are expelled just shortly before the Arabs arrive. Then Rome, right? There will be all an issue, a controversy with Rome later on, because the rights were diverging, right? While the Gauls, generally speaking, the Franks, the Burgundians, even those Visigoths that had remained in Gaul in part, and the Anglo-Saxons, and then the newly converted Germans, and even Slavs, simply say Rome is Rome. Rome is the center. Rome is the only gate to civilization. And there is a massive acculturation and civilization of these countries through Rome, chiefly. Like, there is not another sort of center in the West that emanates this kind of forces by itself. Like, if it is, it's because fundamentally of a Roman legacy, reinvigorated by the Germanic conquerors, especially in military terms, that draws constantly from Rome everything. This is true for Charlemagne. This is true for the Ottonians. The Ottonians are also inspired by the Byzantines. That's true, but never dreaming sort of to deny their own Westernness and their own Romanity, considering the privilege that had been established by them by the papacy and in that relation with the Church of Rome. In fact, the imperial legacy. But the councils of Toledo are a very sort of Byzantine-looking thing that, in part, gets obliterated by the Arabs when they arrive. Right? The Visigoths also enhance some of the very fiercest anti-Jewish jurisdiction and in the entire Romano-Germanic world, and it doesn't seem that this helped more than much. On the contrary, actually, because the Jews of Spain sided with the Arabs at the point. This is not what happens in the rest of Western Europe at the same time. And the Arabs take over the kingdom and rule over Spain for 700 years. And just for half of a millennium, like controlling most of the Iberian Peninsula. So when you look at this, all exceptions made, etc., when you realize the distribution of population, essentially half of the entire European population is concentrated in Gaul and Italy. All right, it's not even just like the Byzantine world had bigger cities than the West. Yes, Constantinople was that big, but I mean, as a broader fabric, like of urbanism, this actually continues well into the West. The Slavs basically had not even had, aside from some in the Balkans, an actual urbanization before. I mean, not as Slavs, but I mean settling in places where cities had existed. And it's not like, by the way, the Danubian frontier was that prosperous, but Western Europe really was. And so if we're talking literally 1/4 of Europe being Italian, say, by the 13th century, and France having actually a larger population than Italy at the time, Italy being the richest per capita country in the world uninterruptedly, even throughout the early Middle Ages, from Roman times to the late 17th century, and Gaul at large being, in absolute terms, the richest country in Europe, you can easily see, and just by a basic sort of, here I'm not sort of showing it to you, but a basic sort of immediate idea of the distribution of wealth and population and civilizational accomplishments, statehood, bureaucracy, literacy, technology, art, law, etc., is concentrated there. You also realize that all the system was overwhelmingly interconnected, and that's why I make, together with historiography, that actually doesn't make this more than I do, right? Because historiography tends to, again, it mostly comes from the structuralistic background. It also tends to be a bit morally relativistic in cultural terms, and so it says, let's study every single different place, a localistic mentality, the one I was talking about before, hyper-focusing just on one place and ignoring all the rest. If you actually look at this world system, and it's not like Spain did either, right? Especially after the Reconquista, but also before, the Caliphate of Cordoba was something really. England was pretty developed. Some certain parts of Germany, especially the south, the Rhineland, right? These were very advanced places at large. There is no comparison with anything you have in southeastern Europe, say the Balkans, and probably in Eastern Europe, right? At large, you realize that the more civilized countries there in the Islamic world are, in fact, even not necessarily the ones that are geographically closer to civilization. Again, Bulgaria is not, or Serbia are not so civilized as Poland, debatably. Maybe, actually, like during the High Middle Ages, you can make some point for that, but tendentially what you see throughout the Middle Ages is that Romano-Germanic system fundamentally incorporates also the Western Slavs in a way that makes them, to this day, actually more developed than the rest equally. What is the most developed part of Ruthenia? Overwhelmingly Kiev, Galicia. I made also a video about this recently. There is there all the history of the Uniate Church, just like there was a Latin Patriarch of Constantinople after 1204. In Galicia, especially after the Mongol conquest, there is need to escape that pressure by essentially reuniting with Rome. The history of Galicia in particular is the one of Poland, the Habsburgic Empire later, but even Kiev, like the notion, even in the later Middle Ages, that Moscow, via Vladimir, had actually gotten this, had become the third Rome, well, it's completely false. It's a notion that was mostly just made up in the last couple of hundred of years. At the time, they didn't absolutely reason like that. Always remember that modern Russian identity was actually coined in the 18th century at the College of Chernihiv, Ukraine, for the Tsars on purpose, because actually the Ruthenian Palatinate was way more culturally advanced than all the rest. Hell, they civilized Lithuania single-handedly. The Lithuanians even adopted Slavonic for their church, for their state even, because they were so underdeveloped that they preferred to get part of their, this way more advanced southwestern Ruthenia as a model of acculturation for their standards. There's a history of the Uniate Church. I made multiple videos about also modern contemporary Ukraine that leaves into, in fact, literally the West. Again, first the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, then the Habsburgic Empire. And there are parts of today's Ukraine that were under some forms of Russian control, whether Tsarist or Soviet, etc., for just less than 1 century, historically. And they always maintained the fact that they were actually central. They had the actual patriarchate of all the Rus, right? And the notion that the Muscovy had gotten it by itself is something that eventually prevailed just because the Tsarist Empire took over many of these lands. But in medieval, early modern times, this was completely made up, right? The ways Moscow came to claim that in the 16th century, it was incredibly shady. By a Patriarch of Constantinople was imprisoned by the same Muscovites and by the same Ottomans. All this while the Patriarchate of Constantinople was under Islamic control, under Islamic rule, and while instead Ruthenians were actually, well placed within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth compared to these other areas, regardless of the fact that it had been taken over, yes, but they lived far better than these other Ruthenian elements or whatever was happening in the Balkans under the Ottomans, right? And this is something you can easily see just out of visiting, places like Lviv, etc. The fact that Europeans lacked this notion, and at least Westerners, the world in general, has not really looked too much at this for reasons that perhaps we will explain later en passant, is disturbing, because this is actually the legacy of an actual Catholic overlordship over Europe that was maintained in a cohesive sense, regardless. And this is very unique of us Europeans. I also made a video about, I was commenting on, I don't remember that guy's name, but, why China did keep united or reunite or historically and Europe not after the Roman Empire. Because it's wrong to conceive in the first place that what you see as Western civilization is the product of some sort of radical ethno-nationalistic or statalistic separation that is just like a 19th century self-referential and hyper within West focused and non-comparative and diachronic and especially traditionally based sort of invention of the last couple of hundred of years. If you look at the West from outside the West, you immediately recognize that we are practically the same thing. Yes, we speak different languages. Yes, we look different. We are under different flags. We have all different sort of countries' histories that is very neatly outlined, and especially in the West, that really witnessed that greater continuity of civilizational history. But the more that is separated, the more that is actually united, the more that is actually cohesive. And this sticks to the European mindset, because if you go in the East, it's not much about, of course, the post-socialist trauma, but the entire view of a post-socialist is mostly like fog of war around you, complete darkness surrounding you. You're the only thing that exists, threatened by something externally. In the West, we are open. Like, we just think that we are there to rule the world, and we are familiar with one another. At large, of course, people all over the world, including the West, are particularly undereducated, yet we are still by far and disproportionately the more educated, more aware. And I don't think this can be said for anything that pertains to, especially a Greek, not a Greco-Slavic, because as we've seen, the Slavs are separated, but properly a Greek Orthodox perspective. That doesn't seem anything more competitive and actually shows great signs of decline. Again, Russia is a strongly anti-traditional country under any cultural point of view. There's an overwhelming amount of atheism. 6% of the population lives in slavery. The socioeconomical conditions are appalling. Abortion everywhere, heavy socialistic subsidiary welfare, very low level of education masked by, we're schooling more people than anybody. Yes, of course, thanks. If you just check a box for, something that is completely world, I mean, a master thesis there is barely like a, bachelor one for today. It's all worse, basically, than before. Disproportionate amount of sexual violence, rape, abuses, mental illnesses, depression. So nobody really understands how this would be any kind of actual, even center, alleged center, if ever was, which historically definitely isn't, of any kind of sort of Greek Orthodox civilization or whatever they think this is supposed to be. For not talking about the overwhelming amount of Islamic immigrants that are literally everywhere, like the same levels of Western Europe, as a matter of fact. But again, the notion there is religion is waved as a faker to say, look, we are something separated from the other. And of course, nobody has the palest idea of what religion is, where it comes from, what kind of history they had. Zero. Complete nothing. I talked to thousands of them in my life, and I can assure you, it's mind-blowing until you start speaking with somebody who is actually not belonging to European tradition. You do not understand how bad it gets, right? How empty, how dark, how paranoid, how passive-aggressive, how phrenesthetic, how emotionally weak, how uncontrolled this can't get. It's literally appalling, and it's a devastating realization but that at the same time responsibilizes you, because you do start understanding what's the actual value, not just of civilization, but of tradition, right? So here, continuing the message, in a broad sense, there seems to be a similar parallel of the Slavs and Germans adopting Roman civilization, but the latter often receives more attention, right? So again, this is true if we take into consideration, of course, the role that the broader Germanic world had within the West. If we talk about countries like England or Germany, also Scandinavia, etc., well, you compare it with the Slavic world, you can make, of course, a point that by proportion, it's not like the Slavic world did not count or was not important, it was not producing culture, wasn't civilized. They were. However, as we just said, this is true mostly for Slavs that also fell into the Romano-Germanic sphere of influence, but properly culture, right? Because they were not subjects, they were not passive to that, all right? Bohemia, Poland, okay, well, to some degree, yes, they were very heavily influenced by the Germans, to say the least, but there's never like a full direct domination. Even Bohemia within the Holy Roman Empire is a kingdom on its own, actually wins a highly prestigious sort of position. It's mostly the later Middle Ages that the Hussites that turn it into a failed state. But Poland also lives on with great accomplishments. Two, because the other systems basically fail. In fact, at the end, these other Slavs are taken over by the Ottomans in the Balkans. In Eastern Europe, they remain in part isolated, especially if you look at the Muscovites, already something that was borderline Tartar to begin with, perceived like this in especially still in a Renaissance perspective, which is a pity again, because up to a few centuries before, they were very, very, very connected to the West. They were much more looking like a Central European country. They were very similar to Poland. But the Mongol invasions and late medieval crisis changes everything. It's also true that, again, the Germanic world is eventually just more important than this truly becomes a fringe, especially the one that, in fact, remains truly Orthodox and so connected to this allegedly Greco-Slavic civilization, and saying, look, this is more important than the Germanic world. No. All right? It's not even just about late modern history accomplishments. In the Middle Ages, in the early modern era, definitely the Germanic world gave more, right? The Germans already from late antiquity are more developed than the Slavs. They have more cohesive political systems. They're more militarily powerful. They're also more easily Romanized, right? We're not talking here just about the Romano-Germanic kingdoms, but say those will also expand into pre-Christian Germanic eras that at large are actually Christianizing themselves in the process. Yes, Saxony is, of course, the example of a very brutal military conquest, but say even if evangelization did often pass, this is true also for the Slavic world, through internecine warfare, say Scandinavia converts itself by itself, and of course they stay, as we were saying before, side of Rome, etc. So I would say that overall, the attention towards the Germans, the Germanics, let's say, is more understandable, more justified even from a strictly historical point of view. The Slavs, in proportion, I do believe myself, that get less attention than the one they should have, but it can't be a greater attention than the Germanic system. Especially if you make this crucial distinction. If you pick everybody who stayed within Roman Christianity and not the ones who belong to this sort of Greek-Slavic covenant, because this is the meaning of the entire question, right? If you say Greco-Slavic, you cannot associate this to Poland or to Bohemia or to Croatia, right? These were Romano-Slavic themselves, just like the Germans were Romano-Germanic in that civilizational sense. And definitely, yes, this system was more important than that Greek Orthodox world that essentially became fringe the more time passed. In the Slavic case, it had sort of always been, because again, the more north and east you go, and you understand why that is the case. But the Byzantines also collapse at the end of the day, and they do collapse because the Westerners take over in many ways. I was asked by a guy who was also, probably not very young from the picture, when I made that video about the hard-to-die myth of Latin Germanic Western backwardness. But isn't it, that like the West rose because the Greek Orthodox world was declining? Well, why do you think that it was declining? The Siculo-Normans were surely a much bigger existential threat for Constantinople than the Seljuk Turks, I can assure you. As also, by the way, the Byzantine reconquest of Anatolia shows before Myriokephalon, because let's not forget about this, that the Byzantine, this can be replicated in proportion to the Islamic world. Like the Byzantines as Europeans were much more successful as a civilization than the broader Islamic world. And at large, if the Byzantine Empire collapsed, the main reason was the West, was not the East. All right. This is also, I don't think I need to explain this. Some of you asked me for Fourth Crusade video, etc. But I made also lots of videos about the Komnenians, and you perfectly know that they didn't really have too many good relations with the West entirely. They were always threatened, and they did try to strike back, but in that sense, the strength ratio is not really pointing at a overwhelming capacity of the Byzantines to simply take over the West, unlike what actually happened instead by the Westerners. And again, it's not like dice rolling. The Byzantines in the 12th and the 13th century, or even before, for that matter, they tried it. The last thing was Justinian, that mostly stuck to that kind of, again, Byzantine rather than Roman sense of power, that is just the coasts and the ports, and what can be connected through Byzantine telexocracy at the time, at least before the Arabs arrived. The hinterland is a completely different story. All right, so it's already a very different thing from what the Romans had done in the West already. And that's also the big elephant in the room, Roman legacy, right? That doesn't disappear. And again, it's terrible how Westerners are sometimes so fussy about, again, this Romano-Germanic tension, when they don't realize that what emerges in the Middle Ages is, as the actual message was correctly saying, a syncresis, right? And that at large, however, it's way more balanced in favor of the strictly Roman than simply Germanic legacy, at least in strictly civilizational terms. Here, I don't even have to explain what Western civilization was in the 13th century, because that is the peak of this blossoming, to say the least, if not explosion, because made so many videos there about the topic that exemplify everything by so much more ad hoc examples that I don't need to repeat now. So I contend this notion that the Slavs do not get sort of the recognition that they should when they are specifically connected with a Greek Orthodox culture, because these were the more fringe ones at large. And so it's possible, absolutely, that in absolute terms, they do not even the Germans or not even the Romans get, I mean, history does not get enough attention to begin with, and properly, even within historiography, you do not have this kind of discussions more than much. Everything is normally and conventionally is, nobody talks about this culturally hegemonic ideas because it sounds very much like World War II vibe, right? But these are debates that we must have if we want to objectivize history. But in relation to the Germans, I think it's kind of normal, or the Germanics, like it's kind of normal. This can be appreciated in many other ways. Think about the Ostsiedlung in medieval times. Just think about the same, again, Latin Germanic civilization creating lots of issues to the Byzantines and basically knocking them out. So the message continues and says, though I fully acknowledge that your YouTube channel has provided a numerous example of the Greek and Slavic cultural union, you still have not recognized their civilization as something that is as palpable as Latin Germanic Europe. Exactly. And I think I just explained why. I definitely don't recognize them. I don't see a Greco-Slavic civilization of the same substance of the Romano-Germanic one. I mean, you can't really speak of a specifically Romano-Germanic civilization in big terms that transcend even the same ethnic Romanity or Germanicity of the system, because you get even Slavs or Celts within them. And at large, Romanity is to be understood in a metaphysical sense, especially when the imperial Catholic power is concerned, that the Germans basically seize. Hence the Holy Roman Empire, the World Ghibelline myth, etc. But it's real, right? It's a more dysfunctional system than what the Roman one had been historically. But given the degeneration of humanity throughout the millennia, definitely what was accomplished by the Romano-Germanic system in the Middle Ages is clamorous. And I don't see this being a thing comparable with the Greco-Slavic world. I don't deny the existence of a Greco-Slavic civilization, I just think that I don't recognize it as, again, the definition of the message here is really helpful, as palpable as Latin Germanic Europe. I just don't. It's something else, it's something different. I did cover this civilization in many videos. In fact, as you acknowledge yourself, I did talk specifically about that also very well-known field of studies that definitely exists, scholarly speaking, about this Greco-Slavic world. All right, it does exist, it's a thing, especially the history of Bulgaria, the history of Serbia, the history of the Rus. You name it, there are sort of deep interconnections. Again, the early attempts of converting Moravia, the issues with, in fact, some powers that were going back and forth. Again, also those show the fringe nature of the system, the fact that there wasn't really an interpenetration, say, of Greek and Slavic culture to the degree you can see in the West. It is much more fully functional at a political, institutional, administrative, cultural, literary, etc. level. There is great art from the Greco-Slavic world that is also very sort of Byzantine, the more intense the connection is. There is a general sense that, of course, Constantinople was a very important center. But if you look at the peoples that gravitated around it historically, they were fringe compared to the bigger powers of the West. This is true for southern Italy, at least up to the Norman conquest. This is true for again, the Balkans. This is true for Eastern Europe. And it's not like things change more than much, by the way. I mean, in that video about Oli of Kiev, by the way, I was discussing exactly this fact that, I mean, it's not like Constantinople ever dreamt to wage an invasion of Ruthenia and taking over Kiev, right? Yes, they had factions locally that could be more or less used as leverage, but I don't know, the Romano-Germanic world is something that organized military expeditions together to go conquer Jerusalem and succeed in the 11th century. There was a Charlemagne. There was a broadly ethnically expansive system that, in a Slavic sense, especially during the Ostsiedlung, was sort of overthrown. The Slavs, by the way, were at times under the heavy influence of the Huns, the Avars, the Magyars. The Germans had been, by the way, originally, but later, mostly, they are more susceptible of destabilization. In fact, they pay a toll for being more exposed to the steppe peoples. We know this very well. We discussed this very much in many videos. This is true also during the Mongol invasions. This is absolutely true. They're paying a penalty in many ways, climate distance from civilization. But in this sense, you do not see stronger links between the Slavs and Constantinople than you can see between a world that is recognizably as Romano-Germanic by definition. You look at the Kievan Rus, it's not a Greek world, right? It may have, of course, a Greek rite, but let's not forget this is also meant to be, in theory, a Catholic rite of some sort, right? So even the contrast between Rome and Constantinople when comparing these two civilizations lays in the fact that Rome really kept having a nurturing capacity throughout all the era and beyond, whereas Constantinople was mostly seen as a partner that could provide with these tools for developing civilization, but among peoples that fundamentally would remain on their own and that were also even tendentially more prone to not just to escape Constantinopolitan power or control of any kind, but also bonding with the West, which is a bit the notion that you don't hear very often. I myself, just discovered in the last years that Ruthenia was incredibly interconnected with the West in ways that personally I had never seen in pop culture, because everybody knows the story. Okay, the Byzantines convert the Rus. Well, every medieval manual has the chapter, but if you go a bit beyond that, you realize that the connections with the West, the intricacies, also political alignment within the various Slavic states, how Moravia was a battleground between Rome and Constantinople, how this Greco-Slavs, so to say, were also quite flirtatious with Rome in ways that the Romano-Germanic War didn't even think to do with Constantinople against Rome at any point, I think is pretty telling about the relation involved. So yes, I do believe that you cannot recognize a Greco-Slavic civilization, especially on the same grounds you can see a Romano-Germanic one. And simply telling the history of those regions, even individually, on the basis of that, right? Also because, by the way, there are so many differences. Think, for example, at how different urbanization was, right? In the Kievan Rus, for example, there is a great separation historically between the big cities along the great Russian riverways that leave exactly of that contact with the outer world, including and especially Constantinople, but mostly because of local resources, of course, that could be traded across this major riverways. And, for example, the countryside is very disconnected from that. I mean, the local princes didn't even attempt to be too much involved into this interland affairs. They prefer to make coups in the various Ruthenian cities and claiming that, again, historical overlordship of the Grand Principality. In the West, it's completely different. The West is heavily interconnected. Not just the countryside is very connected to the cities, but there are many cities that are thriving. They are part of bigger, more unitary, more solid systems. They routinely see themselves communicating with one another across countries for matters of broader political coordination, ecclesiastical administration. There is, again, a much speedier cultural amalgamation from a very long time, again, since the Roman conquest of the West. It's not an interrupted process. And just the level of development is radically different. And this, of course, gives the West, Romano-Germanic civilization, a great extra gear to begin with, right? So, yeah, that's the point. And then the message says, I was wondering why this was the case, or perhaps I just need to spend more time digging through your videos. In a sense, yes, but for the rest, I just made this video to explain this better. I'd also like to clarify that I'm not a nationalist from Eastern Europe. I'm an American with heritage from East Asia. My question stems from genuine curiosity, not from nationalist vitriol. Regards, a fan. So yeah, more or less, this is the point of it all. It's not that straightforward sometimes to describe this comprehensively, because normally when I when I make videos about Europe, I tend to be more circumscribed to specific areas. What I think we're witnessing today, I must say, to clarify better, because I like this guy that says, I'm actually from the US, I'm Asian, I don't have any particular connection with Eastern Europe. Even the language here is interesting, because again, Americans, this is normal in a sense, but the concept of Eastern Europe, as you know, which is something that people from countries, let's say, like Poland, Czech, etc., hate because they consider themselves as Central European, or if they consider themselves as Eastern Europeans, it's mostly like a post-socialist reflex. There is no doubt that you can, on the basis of the latter, sort of divide in halves without in-betweens, Western from Eastern Europe, because by far in Europe the greatest divide by far is between West and East, right? It's not between North and South. As a matter of fact, actually, Southwestern Europeans are very rich, and literally even more than some Germanic country. And so even in there is actually, if you look at European macroeconomics, something extremely counter-narrative, right? The notion, again, the Germanics were more advanced during the modern era. It's the Protestant. where exactly, because if we're talking, I mean, Belgium, France are overwhelmingly rich. They're richer than the Netherlands. They're richer than Germany. Even Italy's richer than Germany. And if you cross, just southern Italy is like post-socialist Europe, and also most of Spain, except the northeast fundamentally. But in that sense, you see that the blue banana from Benelux to central Italy, fundamentally, including southern Germany, those are the richest parts of Europe. And so, I don't know, Sweden is not richer than France or Italy, and so you have to explain there, or Spain for that matter. So it's also very, very, very interesting to see what we understand history like. So I understand that this statement, like you may be, I don't know, not recognizing this Greco-Slavic word, is because we could, I mean, the author of this message could be thinking mostly at a Western Europe versus an Eastern Europe of some sort, which may be an American thing to do. I would like to point out that, again, however, Central Europe is the big missing piece in the room, mostly. When you look at Germany, Czech Republic, Austria, Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, to etc. It's the Central Europe is not an opinion, right? It's something that it's huge, by the way, and it's in fact sensibly more developed than Eastern Europe, narrowly meant. It's not just socialism. That this is, of course, socialism was one of the greatest disasters in the history of mankind. There's no doubt about that. But the reason why socialism also existed, the more east you go, is this kind of divide that historically existed in Europe, where civilization was disproportionately concentrated in the West since at least Roman times, right? And in ways that we tend to underplay, especially when the migration era, the early Middle Ages, kicks in. Mostly because some people enjoy the idea that the Romans were destroyed or defeated or massacred or whatever, and actually they're not just their legacy, but they themselves as a civilization continued, also demographically, culturally, economically, in ways that, frankly, I think have been radically underplayed in historiography. I read manuals from different countries, and I was shocked to see how sort of crossing out some of the most important pages of also medieval civilization on this sort of ethnocentric basis really seemed to be not really helping to picture Europe as such. I mean, think about it. If you are an American, you will tend to see Europe also in different ways, through different filters. You're not maybe so fond about its unity. You do not feel it the way we feel it. It may be, again, a British lens sometimes, with all that's because this was so clamorously impacting culturally wise in the world, so that carries all that it's a regional perspective with it. But the reason actually why I acknowledge so much Romano-Germanic civilization is that I have grown increasingly shocked to realize how, in fact, this is the topic we should overwhelmingly concentrate about, given the way it's been underplayed and sort of probably willingly removed by some extent, like by some level of deliberate will for some cultural reason that maybe, as ugly as it sounds, it's not a few time ago that Europeans really considered themselves in terms of racism, inferiority, of sort of this sense of social Darwinism that, however, like could be the case when it is an actual thing. I mean, if it's like with the idea of cultural racism, if a country is more underdeveloped, it's that, people at large are worse. You can't deny that. But when you realize that this is very much inaccurate and incorrect, And history actually can't be denied when it comes to these macroscopical indicators more than much. You realize that probably at a cultural level there was some rigging of the narrative. The reason, and that's why, again, I like to talk about it, I didn't know it myself. The reason why, however, I think that questions like these are asked, I don't know whether this is the case for the author of this message. I don't want to pass, in fact, this message about it, but is the notion that today we would allegedly be struggling against some kind of Eastern Orthodox power that is now perceived as alternative to the West. This is not happening. I don't know how to. This is not just about the war in Ukraine, and I think described pretty well what we all knew by following, say, basic military knowledge, like from journals, analysts, etc., from the quality of the Russian army before the war itself. But just make the maths and realize what the West is and why, not just from a military point of view, that alone would, for a military historical channel, would just speak volumes about what's the entire picture, but how historically unsuccessful the Greek Orthodox world actually was, and how all this sense of grievance, of revanchism, of paranoia, of obsession with, enmity, etc., comes obviously from a world that cannot accept what it was. And actually, speaking of Ukraine, what we said before about the Galicia, for example, about the Kievan Rus, the Uniate Church, I think that the success of Ukraine against Russia, against what I would say just most people unfairly believe to be radically unfavorable odds, mostly due to the lack of any strategic education and mostly military historical culture, exemplifies. I mean, Ukraine as a country, as a culture, is something that was not just very much definite in historical terms up to someone decided now to act as the Eastern European history expert that denying that Ukraine exists. It's like, mostly the same reasons why people claim that Ukraine does not exist is the same reason why they think that Austria should not exist, given the existence of a Germany, historically speaking, or other countries nobody would ever dream, just like Ukraine before the war, to see as a non-country. But also and especially from the fact that it was very much Western influenced. And this is really true for the entire picture of Europe, I would say. So it's not really the fact of pretending that something is better, worse, or more or less important. It's in many ways having the courage of digging a bit deeper. Now, I'm not paraphrasing the message here, because it says, if I dug maybe a bit more in your content because you have so much, that's probably valid in general, but I am not reproaching you for not having done this, not criticizing your insight. I think it was an important question, again, mostly for the later historical developments. I mean, I have people here that would like to pretend that cultural values, the historical past, like political strength, comes from what they feel like. Remember, it's not like the left invented this and we fought against it for decades now, and the right is normal. Like, if a culture produces that kind of left, the right at large is basically the same, and exactly at this point, the latter is whining in the same way, which I find terrifying as a beyond far-right wing channel in a way that is really appalling, and that frankly fits pretty much with the imperially Catholic traditional knowledge. That is the same one that you can easily observe through this historical pattern, at some point vanishing, but at some point being also very strong. And therefore, I would say that both today and in the past, it's important to reason in terms of big divisions, sort of, it's necessary, as I always say, to start from the general, right? Before knowing the essentials. It's just like laying the foundations of a particular historical knowledge and then passing to the more in-depth one. It's difficult to simply outline these civilizations, if we want to call them like this, because this is also contentious. What do we mean by civilization here? Today I treated this mostly as, it's both civilization and culture fundamentally. But civilization is sort of more politically and institutionally relevant. That is to say, how were these systems organized? How did they actually play with one another? How did they interact with the rest? And culturally wise, you can make divides on the basis, for example, of this ethnos, like the Slavs, for example. And at the same time, it's important to look at the detail as well. Like, how different were these systems? Right? It's important to ask. At some point, these systems took different directions. They received different influences. They developed in different ways. And so you could make an entire video trying to mostly distract also from the notion that you can neatly outline these divides. But they did exist as well, actually. What I would say is not to, let's say, just imagine it as a map of something that you can color accordingly to the site. It's more about the intensity. It's more about, in history, it's really important to understand which were the actual centers of power and what does this mean exactly. Essentially, who does rule from where? What kind of political success does he obtain accordingly? What kind of military power can he wield? What can he actually do with that? How much can he influence others? In this sense, I don't think there is much doubt regarding the two contenders here and why they are of two different levels of value. And again, yes, there was a Greco-Slavic civilization, no doubt. But it's substantially different in civilizational quality to the Romano-Germanic one. What else could I say? I think as I was saying at the beginning, Schwerpunkt gave me this enormous opportunity of browsing practically every country in medieval Europe by some level of depth. And I acknowledged, first, I must say, I truly finally got to understand in a basically satisfactory way what, for example, also from my perspective, Central Eastern Europe is, right? Because it's not easy. Sometimes you hear, I realize, because you pass through that, you're not born with this ingrained knowledge. You have to build it, right? You know different regions across the place. Where is Podolia? What is its history? What's Sorabia? What's Semigalia? Those are things that really matter. Like, you don't know them until you do, and you say, so that is you see the puzzle being recomposed in front of your eyes, and you start understanding what happened for which reason. All right, there was an interesting interview I made last year. It was still not published. I don't know where it's going to be. I should contact the guy on Lithuania. The guy has a pretty large channel, hundreds of thousands, and he makes cool videos. It would be really useful for Schwerpunkt's propaganda, so to say. And it was about Lithuania, and this guy mostly talks about contemporary history. Like, he could not really grasp the fact of the difficulties that Lithuania had in medieval times, in spite of its success in extending as the largest contiguous dominion, territorially wise, in Europe at some point in the 14th century. Because people are often fooled by that, like how big is a power on the map, and thinking that corresponds to actual power, to some overwhelmingly glorious accomplishment, an extra year of power. And that is actually indicative of just, reasoning just at some dimension. That is not too helpful. Regarding this thing of nationalism, by the way, it's true that I would think today my contention was on Schwerpunkt mostly the fact that we didn't make a good work in Europe to bring post-socialist countries within the system. From one side, of course, we're very successful, right? You look at Western Slavic countries, you look at some Balkan ones, and in spite of certain political regimes, you can't find a general functionality of it. Also, those who make counterculture, in that sense, they're doing it just because they have something to gain as individual countries, not because they're actually willing to destroy the system as such. There is a lot of bad sort of manipulation of thought regarding these things. But there is this dreadful aspect about, say, mostly post-socialist countries. From one side, you have the left and the right, right? And at large, you've had Europe being considered, say the EU, considered not necessarily like a leftist force entirely, but one definitely leaning towards that, with especially like this inexplicable green. You could explain them easily, actually, but and mostly uncontrolled immigration policies that emphasized, just by being from that side of the aisle, the fact, because there are basically France, Germany, and Italy pay for all the rest of Europe, right? So, and this includes educational programs, just subsidies to make, of course, these countries grow faster, but to leave them behind, to expand the Eurozone and driving these forces away from mostly Russia. But being there, in fact, the EU proclaimed itself. That's why I was reluctant to properly say that it's a leftist, because it does sound very propagandistic. But at large, like, there are some elements of it that work, that are. And things are actually more complicated. But fascism and communism were both rejected. Like, the EU came up like some years ago with this very clear equation of the two things that frankly cannot be equated in an historical sense, but politically wise, I think was very useful to properly list all what is not tolerated in Europe and what we aren't. And we don't have to be powerful in being able to expand and control. And yet, the sort of the main attitude towards post-socialists from the left, let's even skip this thing of the EU, because otherwise it becomes too complicated. But the left in general says, these guys are, poor, so we have to understand them, we have to subsidize them, and we have to include them, and whatever, and let's not look at what they actually think or believe, or what kind of background they may have that could be truly European in values or whatever. From the other side, the right says, no, these guys are purely traditional, they are the superheroes of the situation, they're so strong, they live so well, and whatever, which is actually not true by far, and actually post-socialism has surgically removed an overwhelming amount of tradition. I mean, if you mean by tradition being just mostly white and, straight in also general customs and behavior, that is not enough to be a traditionalist, in case you do not know. Actually, in many of these cultures, there is either there's a rampant nationalism and or socialism at the same time. Especially the latter aspect is underrated, because you understand a sort of nationalistic belief from these guys, which may be counterintuitive given their post-socialist past, but as I often say, nationalism and socialism actually cannot go without one another at the same time. But there is also a very heavy process of secularization, atheization, anti-clericalism, a general sense of distrust, of paranoia, of fear, of terror, stemming from the way simply they were ruled, which, by the way, is sort of hidden by them. I mean, the notion of properly the sense of shame, right, stemming from the fact of having been part of a socialist past is very heavy. And it is something which, as I was saying before, in an anti-Western sense, is mostly used to try to mask the reality in which the socialist legacy is pretty much strongly alive and there in ways that are appallingly painful, right? But for everybody involved. And so this sense of power is not there. These are the guys who are literally subsidizing for growing that way. And that, again, also in the parts that are not part of the EU, are dramatically lagging behind in ways that are inconceivable, especially from a Western perspective and sort of more narrowly meant. I personally, I love Slavic countries. I had a Slavic ex. It was Catholic, by the way. That is something that was part of the imperial Catholic world. Then I would like to get married currently with an Orthodox Slav, and that's to me very intriguing. But she's of course from the right side of the aisle, and the point is this. It's not like I say this as a sort of contempt or because I don't like. Honestly, I think they're the most fascinating peoples in Europe. I mean, at least in this political, currently political sense, given their historical past, their cultural legacy, they're the ones that I think extraordinary resources could be drawn from. Because it is true that the West has huge issues and that we're doing very badly in so many fields, that these countries at some point are a standard, a bulwark, but they are also in ways that are not so self-aware of it, that do not take into consideration the broader picture, and that in fact is damaging them, and that is making them lag behind. That's why it's our task also to be up to them and vice versa, right? There is so much to gain from it. And I am so much convinced that what I see in history is the key to it, because we have this fantastic millenary legacy together. And it doesn't make sense to pretend to create these divides when our traditional identity is based on a unitary power. It really does not make any sense. So the point, in my view, is that we should have more of these talks, right? I find it incredibly dumb, honestly. This is it. I say it with all my heart. To see, I don't know, Slavic countries, for example, in reenactment activities. There are also some sort of subcultural social phenomenon to some degree, pretending to be, I don't know, some sort of more easternly exotic copy of the Vikings, because they properly can't accept that there are civilizational standards that make countries great, and that also their own countries deserve so much more and better. This is a problem we have in the West as well. How many people are obsessed with the migration era and this kind of more ethnic phenomena? How many people are obsessed with the Viking Age and literally do not know anything about later medieval Scandinavia? That is amazing. So the question there is also, I say it as a historian, of course, people do not seem to have the palest idea of what the blip their past was, right? Let's cancel this nonsense for lesser people that basically the average person has any idea about the historical past of its country. The average person, even in the most educated countries in the world, doesn't have the palest idea of what history is or what it's supposed to be. And this is much worse for the younger generations, even that you may even conceive to be like some sort of clean tablets you can write on without externally, but unfortunately it's never like just plain ignorance or absence of knowledge. It's like just like dumb parents inculcating them complete nonsense, like a complete alienation from factual reality, not just for the past but for the present. So you can imagine how difficult at that point even having an education becomes. And as I was saying in the other video the other day about just how to handle knowledge in general, we, like up to a few years ago, I was reasoning in terms of, well, fundamentally historical knowledge will go more or less some refined direction. On the basis of what I learned, for example, in still actually functional educational system. I can't say that it's not the myth that, again, education or whatever, it was all rigged by the left. It's not true. Like, it's not like there wasn't an influence of the left. But it allowed me, for example, in my educational system to go without it, actually, and evenly driving pretty much away from that and countering it. And actually, I think I don't even spend too much time countering it. I prefer to tell the actual history, as I understand it, which is also part of the reason why you're following me to a degree. And so I think it's a difficult time, but in all difficult times of crisis, there is the opportunity to redraw things. And if we manage to do it accurately, we can go very far to everybody's benefit. And I see in this shared and common history, rather than the need for competing in terms of, the Greco-Slavic world was sort of underdeveloped compared to the West, let's reason what it meant to be a traditional Catholic empire, which also the Greek Orthodox one was historically, because, again, the name officially was always Catholic since the foundation of Christianity. And of course, the empire was already before Christianity. And let's understand how our historical shortcomings fit that unitary view. Because that, if you think about it, it's the only way to fix the system. Because otherwise, what are you going to pursue? Further fragmentation? That means further narcissism, right? If you don't have a single authority, if you don't have a single hierarchy, the question is, who are you to even have the standards, to pretend to have the standards to know better? Like, if you do, good for you. You may be at the top of the hierarchy. But if you don't, as basically the entirety of the population, the question is, why do you even take that attitude if not by being some sort of hysterically paranoid, self-sabotaging piece of blip that wants to prefer the world to be torn apart and completely destroyed rather than measuring in front of your individual shortcoming? This is the same reason, by the way, why I literally have people that write me, I don't know, from Germany, from places like, I don't know, that are so familiar that literally message me without even knowing my work too well and tell things like, Schwerpunkt, I'm this, I'm that. Like, you literally feel that these people lack some kind of familiar figure in their life and say, I decided to convert to Orthodoxy because I think that, and they explain something like, but I can't even describe how poorly, of course, like saying, because I feel that, I don't know, that's the true way to, the West has failed. The actual reason behind all this, from all the phraseology, is that fundamentally they sympathize for Russia and they want to see the Ukrainians genocide and I don't know what else, because there you even start acknowledging that it's not about wanting anything. In fact, that's why it's not going to happen, because these ideas do not work, right? They're not conducive to anything. Like, even when you manage to destroy the system, it's not like you're going to become better. You're going to be more prosper or more accomplished or just happier to live. Things are becoming easier. You, especially if you are, as it happens overwhelmingly from these cases, at the bottom of the hierarchy, you are the one who's sinking the fastest. I don't know how to explain that to you, but that's always the case, right? The fourth estate, lesser people have always sabotaged the system. But it's not like civilization didn't develop in spite of it. On the contrary, we could weaponize them, and actually, when we could successfully exploit in them, we could even give them a chance of redemption. This is what the West has always done. It's true for the Roman legionnaires, it's true for the French grognard. At some point, enlightened Western elites realized that they could give a chance to a dispossessed mass to create a vast power, giving channeling them into military action. And what I see today with the West and the East, say the post-socialist world, is dysfunction, is the possibility of really giving a narrative that makes sense and that convinces the world of how things should be working. And any attempt to counter this, in any case, is a proof of weakness, and will lead to failure, which has already led to defeat. There would be so much to say about this, because again, it's actually impossibly, even if I don't fully recognize it yet, the single most important political topic in a strictly European sense, like that I think we should provide, right, to the world. So, and I am sure that this is the right way, and it's taking an ever greater importance in my life. And I really hope to live long enough to see this prophecy fulfilled, right? So in videos like this, this may, I don't know, I hope, of course, to make more views than the average with topics like these. But I really care. As you know, I'm passionate about these topics to a degree. I would like always to discuss them over others that I just do for encyclopedical reasons. But at the same time, again, without the latter, you can't even pretend to understand them more than much. Everything gains relevance exactly when you do this. So this, to answer shortly, was there properly a Greco-Slavic civilization? Kind of, but again, not in the comparatively high-sounding sense in which we understand the Romano-Germanic one. And even less a Greek and Slavic cultural union, other term that is used here. There wasn't, right? You can argue, we could have also gone other avenues, for example, seeing how, you see, at large here, this was easy to answer because the Germanic world fit the Latin one, religiously wise. So there aren't separations, and you can argue in that sense that there was a veritable cultural union because Latin was present there everywhere in the official languages. The Greek and Slavic cultural union, really? No. Right. That is fundamentally, I don't believe in it. Right. It wasn't a thing, right? Unless you give to this Greek like some kind of more, again, religious sense. Or maybe just, again, like it wasn't definitely a union. Absolutely not. It's definitely a proper sort of definition for the Romano-Germanic world. At least it's a term that I've never toyed with, and that I could even use. I could even go as far as saying that it existed. Like of course, like at a cultural level, you could find any union possible. There were different unions in different ways. There were other cultural unions in Europe happening. By the way, it's not like this was the only one, if it were to. But it wasn't of the same kind, the same quality of the Latin Germanic one. I really don't. I don't see it. And again, I don't think that we should sort of acknowledge it beyond its limits as something that we could simply counterpose. Right, I am for talking way more about Slavic history. I'm talking definitely about talking the Greco-Slavic civilization in general, but at large, associating these two ethnicities as something cohesive in a broader sense, I don't think is correct. Mostly because Slavs were also from the Roman side, and at large, they derailed further when Constantinople fell, and this doesn't seem there, in fact, to have been even before, like the event such a particular connection that can be so palpable, as the term is like the Romano-Germanic one. By the way, the pictures I used, I should have said this at the beginning, are a mix from my military history videos and more that I made on both Slavic and Byzantine culture. So I used it as a provocation to show that, of course, like the author of the message knows, I've made lots of videos on similar topics fundamentally, but also because people think that because people click like without watching the video, knowing what it talks about. I know that instinctively, again, there is somebody out there that just for making this video is supporting Russia, for example. And I like to exploit them by showing that I handled this stuff as I did with all these pictures that I just pasted and copied from the previous videos. That's the advantage, luxury that I have with Schwerpunkt at this point, having so much content that I can simply find all the images without even searching for them anymore. And that will get me more views, especially, so that's really fantastic, and in general really what I need in a broader sense for also spreading this knowledge further. I mean, if you I like being contentious sometimes. I like, my point now is having refined sort of history enough to be able to provide comprehensive explanations. I also have enough videos out there for people randomly asking similarly themed questions, for making me explain them in a more precise way every time, so further contributing to the growth of the channel and beyond. So again, everything is working as it should. All right. This was my take on it. Of course, giving the devil his due here, the author of the message is not the devil, of course, but in general, you understand that I made lots of videos. Actually, I will post them, as always, among the related, sort of recommended ones down below in the top fixed comment, to just indicate you like other videos in which I discuss something similar, or other videos that I made specifically about this Greco-Slavic civilization, when these two cultures, ethnicities did meet, and indeed also gave rise to very interesting outcomes. All right, but in, again, very different ways from the Romano-Germanic ones. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.